everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is PAVE's 136th virtual panel. We held the similar panel last year. It was 2025. We had a new administration, we had a new Congress, and everyone was saying it was going to be such a big year for AVs. So we wanted to get a sense of what that could look like. So we had invited two incredible experts, Hilary Cain and Finch Fulton, to join us. Last year, it was one of our most popular webinars ever. And so again, we're hearing that 2026 is going to be the year for AVs. So we wanted to invite them back to see which of their predictions came true and where we are a year later. So first, I'd love to start just with, I think a lot of folks know you, but could you start with a quick introduction of each of yourselves? Hilary, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It's good to have the gang back together again. So I'm Hilary Cain, Senior Vice President of Policy at Alliance for Automotive Innovation. We are the main trade association for the auto industry here in the U.S. Before I moved into this role, though, I spent 4 years here at the association leading our technology policy team and ran point on AV policy. And before that, I was also running point on AV policy at Toyota for 8 years. So I have been working on AV policy since 2012. I think I'm one of the OGs in DC that have been working on this portfolio and continue to have a deep passion and enthusiasm for the technology and its promise.
Amazing. And Finch, could you give a little background on yourself, please?
Sure. Former House and Senate staffer. I thought I was one of the OGs, but I only got involved in all of this wizardry back in like 2016 when I started on the transition team. Ultimately working for Secretary Lane Chow, spending all 4 years as part of the Trump administration at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and the President's nominee to be Assistant Secretary. After I lost that job, I moved on to Locomation Autonomous Truck Technology Company, and after I lost that job, I went to K&L Gates. I came to K&L Gates, where I am now, where I lead the Transportation and Infrastructure Policy Group and work with a number of entities in the automated vehicle and transportation ecosystem.
Okay, amazing. And I really want this to be a conversation. So I'd love to hear from both of you. A year ago when you joined us, it was a forward-looking conversation. At the time, people were calling 2025 a turning point for AVs. A year into the new Congress and new administration, can you give us an overview of the current status quo, and also how would you characterize what's actually changed?
I can go first.
Go ahead.
So I do think 2025 was a great building year. Certainly you didn't get everything that you wanted all right away, but why would you be able to get that? That's not the way the government works. What we did see is solid progress in a number of different areas. Certainly Secretary Duffy, the Transportation Secretary, has unveiled a vision for how we should move forward in the world of automated vehicles. We saw a new automated vehicle framework as part of his transportation agenda, acceleration of the Part 555 or the exemption process for demonstrations and commercial operations, and then a number of updates around some key rulemakings to federal motor vehicle safety standards that are unintentional barriers to the deployment of automated vehicles because of the way they were written so many years ago. And also the first ever exemption for a purpose-built driverless vehicle under this new automated vehicle exemption program announced by Secretary Duffy for the Zoox vehicle. We do see a lot of things that are still promised. In the regulatory agendas, we've seen a number of rulemakings advanced, some introduced, and we're promised that more will be introduced in the fall agenda, which should be coming out in the spring because the government has yet to catch up with some lost time. But we do expect more, and ultimately what we find ourselves is a lot of good progress and more things to come on March 10th when NHTSA hosts its ADS workshop, but there's got to be more to come to deliver on this vision that they've laid out.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Finch said. I think 2025 was a critical sort of foundation building year, and then I think the hope, the expectation, the desires to see folks deliver on a lot of that foundational work. I will say just a couple of things, couple of observations I have. One is, there is no doubt there's a clear intention and desire from both administration and key leaders in Congress to move the needle on AV policy. That's unquestioned. And the second thing, and I think this is a positive development, is I think we're seeing growing consensus among policymakers and policy stakeholders on the importance of a policy slash regulatory framework in this space. I'm sensing, and Finch can disagree with me, but sensing a diminishing group of naysayers. They're still there,
Yes.
but they are diminishing. And so that's really promising. And I think a turning point for us in 2025.
Good optimism. Okay, let's start with Congress. And Finch, I want to ask you first. Where does comprehensive AV legislation stand? And to bring your words from a year ago back, when we asked you what the biggest policy questions were, you said safety frameworks, data transparency, workforce impacts, and federal preemption. Do you see any progress in any of those areas? And where are we right now?
The wizardry of my perception from a year ago stands just it's incredible. Those are still the key areas of focus. And what we've seen also, to Hilary's point about bringing more players into the space, I know PAVE and CTA hosted a listening session with the Teamsters last year or the year before now. I'm mixing years. And one of the key things we saw is going back to November. Hilary and I were part of the same conversation with Consumer Technology Association and others, where we were able to come in and work with the Teamsters, work with the Transport Workers Union, work with many of the other industry partners that would be impacted by the Self-Drive Act, which is Congressman Lotta and Dingell's bill to regulate automated vehicles. And working side by side, provision by provision, we got to a good place on that bill that ultimately Hilary and I got to testify before the Energy and Commerce Committee on, where the Teamsters issued a letter of neutrality. They said, this is what we've been demanding. We feel good about where this is going. It wasn't done yet, so we got a letter of neutrality, and we were thrilled with that. We also got that from the Transport Workers Union. What we saw there, though, is while we worked out all of the details and nuances of these key issues, there are others that have refused to participate, that have refused to engage, that are now coming in late in the game and stalling things. The Energy and Commerce Committee, Congresswoman Dingell, Congressman Lotta brought in everybody and tried to invite everybody to be part of this conversation. And there's some that didn't want to engage at all and are now calling their inaction something that should prevent the entire bill from moving forward. So we're going to continue to engage and work on those points. But, for lawmakers, you still have to answer the questions first about safety and how they can put forth these regulations to create one federal framework for safety, as well as, data transparency and some of the other issues we discussed, the different roles of the different levels of government. So right now, we saw the bill advance out of the subcommittee. We have more work to do at the full committee, and it involves bringing together Republican and Democratic members, answering all of their very legitimate concerns about these new technologies and making sure we can get them into a good place where they understand what they're saying yes to. And that work's going to continue through the year, potentially into next year if surface transportation reauthorization doesn't happen this year.
Okay. In terms of a path forward, Hilary, your organization obviously has done a ton of work with EVs, and they've seen a lot more regulatory and policy action at the federal level than AVs have. Are there lessons that the AV ecosystem can learn from that regulatory experience, or any parallels that policymakers should keep in mind?
Yeah, so it's interesting. In the EV space, there's no doubt that the industry is experiencing a bit of a whiplash, right? So we have a very different approach to EVs under the Biden administration than we're seeing under the Trump administration, and navigating those changes in administration perspective is challenging. So what's funny is I was sort of thinking about this issue ahead of this panel last year when we did this. I personally questioned the need for Congress to pass an AV bill. And Finch challenged me on it and talked about, how it was important that Congress act in order to provide sort of durability and consistency and direction in this space. And so I am here to admit that Finch was right and I was wrong. And I now believe that the reason we need Congress, and this is a lesson learned from the EV whiplash that we're experiencing, the reason we need Congress to act and pass a federal AV bill is to provide predictability, consistency, and durability to the administration on AV policy. So, hat in hand, Finch was right.
He'll never let you forget that. Finch, do you see an appetite for creating a distinct ADS regulatory framework or more adapting legacy FMVSS authorities?
Well, I'll weasel and do a little bit of both. Look, there are many things that NHTSA and DOT can do to build on previous guidance. Certainly, we're hearing more. Tuesday's going to focus partially on remote assistance, on operational competencies, and some of the new things that have come up since we last saw NHTSA publish specific guidance around the safety of the vehicle and the 12 critical safety areas that must go into a safety self-assessment. There are also things that they must do through rulemaking, and there are things that we would prefer they do through rulemaking because of the certainty that provides. The joke is that you can always undo guidance with a tweet. It's never been easier to get rid of guidance, right? So you want to make sure that the guidance builds into regulations and builds into permanent law so that innovators, safety advocates, everybody in the space that could be impacted by the technology understands where it is today and where they need to be going in the future. That can really only be done once something is locked into law. And everybody has that clarity, whether provided by Congress or by the department itself, and whether it be on federal motor vehicle safety standards, safety data repositories, or the safety case approach itself. And so I think that we want to see NHTSA taking steps and moving forward in guidance on the pathway towards updating the regulations to allow for these technologies, and not necessarily blocking out what Congress is working on today and passing legislation to enable these technologies.
Yeah, I mean, if I could jump in, one thing that I do think that there has been a shift, a broader shift within the industry on the importance of there being AV specific FMVSS, which when years ago, I can't remember when it was, 2020 maybe, Auto Innovators put out an AV policy roadmap, which had a number of recommendations that we thought the federal government needed to implement in order to set us on the right path. And we as an auto industry at that time sort of came to the conclusion that an AV specific FMVSS is what was ultimately needed to provide predictability, to provide durability, and importantly, to set a federal standard so we could avoid sort of state patchwork. At the time, I think the auto industry saw the value in it, but some of the newer entrants into the sort of AV developers who didn't have historical, hadn't been involved in the auto industry for very long, maybe saw things differently. I am sensing that everyone is sort of converging on this as the ideal path forward. It's hard. It's not easy, but it does seem that there has been a shift towards sort of the need for a federal AV focused FMVSS.
And to Hilary's point, and she's correct, not every part of an AV rulemaking has to be a federal motor vehicle safety standard. We've heard Jonathan Morrison talking about using part regulations, which are different than a federal motor vehicle safety standard, for like the safety case side of a rulemaking. But all the things that go into federal motor vehicle safety standard, which the requirements are all about the parts on a vehicle. And so the requirements for how to move forward with the federal motor vehicle safety standard have to do with how do you test that requirement? How do you make it repeatable? How do you make it randomized? How do you prevent people from, building to the test so that the vehicle is only capable of passing that test, but not necessarily representative of its full capabilities? So there are things that can be done through federal motor vehicle safety standards and things that need to be done through rulemaking outside of that confine. And that will have implications for just how far preemption goes and just how that plays on the federal framework around the country. So there's a balance there that we expect to hear more about on Tuesday.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you mentioned the ADS workshop on Tuesday. Over the last year, though, how would you characterize NHTSA's posture regarding AVs?
I'd have to say, John, I pressed Jonathan on this at the PAVE panel at the Consumer Tech, the CES, the CTA PAVE panel at CES. And I was like, we're running out of time. What are you doing over there? You got to get going. And he essentially was like, I've been here since September, like midway through the month. I just got here. Like we've been laying the groundwork, but I got to get updated. I'm working on fuel efficiency standards. I'm working on, leading the agency. I'm getting my feedback under me. Yeah, it's been a couple of months and I haven't done everything yet, but I just got here. And so it's like, yes, there are fundamental things that get held up when you don't have your leadership confirmed yet, and new people are coming into their seats and you're having to brief people up on issues that they haven't seen before. So we see that, and we see that in every administration. Hopefully, we won't see as many people changing seats and leaving as we've seen in the past. But that sort of consistency and that having to redo a lot of work can hold up a lot of progress, whether it be at DOT or the White House.
Sure. And then, Hillary, do you think the agencies provided greater clarity on ADS equipped vehicle exemption process, or does uncertainty become still a barrier to scale deployment?
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly the announcement that they made mid last year about their intent to sort of update and modernize and streamline the exemption process was welcome. So yes, I mean, that's something that they tackled sort of right out of the gate, and it was welcome. And I think we're all eager to see sort of how it's going to be implemented and play out, and if we're going to start seeing exemptions shake loose here in the next number of months, which I think we are expecting to see. And I mean, I'll just double click on something that Finch said. I mean, I think because Jonathan had been in the building before, that there was a lot of pressure, unfortunately, put on him to sort of hit the ground running. And he did hit the ground running. There's no doubt about it. But it is true that we need to, I think all of us are so who have been working in the space for so long and eager to see meaningful progress, are maybe unfairly impatient at this point. But one area where we have seen meaningful movement is in the exemption space for sure.
There was a little bit of, what do you mean I have to tell you what our needs are? We already told your chief counsel months ago. Like,
exactly.
Just because you weren't allowed to talk to us before now doesn't mean you shouldn't understand and fundamentally know what we need.
Absolutely. And then, Finch, one of the things you had mentioned last year was safety data transparency. Has that conversation evolved? Is there movement toward standardized federal metrics for AV performance comparison?
So this is one of those areas where I think you have to look at, one, what is required by the federal government right now, and two, what is all being required and what are people considering putting in an AV data repository. Fundamentally, the data repository was created on an emergency order by Secretary Buttigieg and was never sort of legitimized through an official rulemaking. They never took comment on it. They never worked on it. They just issued the order and then moved on. So we need to see this legitimized, and we need there to be, and this administration has taken some comment and done this, but whether through Congress, and we've had those conversations there, or through future rulemakings, we need them to take notice and comment so we can continue to increase and improve this on, just how do you report the crash data, on what timelines, what constitutes a crash? Like, is it a damage causing thing? If you back into something and there's no damage, does that count? And then you hear members of Congress talking about, well, we need to capture near misses. We need to capture unexpected stops and other metrics like that. And that's where you start to sort of question, like, what is appropriate for there to be best practices developed? Those best practices can lead into standards. Standards can lead into policy and future rulemakings, but you can't jump straight to the law of what is required when we're still in the best practice area with people figuring out how to measure these things, what metrics are relevant. I mean, you can require miles driven. We've seen that in California, and that incentivizes companies to put vehicles on the road and just run them around and around and around so that they can generate as many miles as possible. But that doesn't prove anything. So we need to make sure we're thoughtful and we use the actual tools that the federal government has in hand to shape the AV data repository to be useful not only for our federal partners at NHTSA, but the state and local regulators that can use this data to better understand the operations around them and the safety of these vehicles.
Yeah, and I will say that the importance of NHTSA having visibility and having this data is not only sort of for their safety sort of oversight mission, but also to inform future rulemaking, right? So I mentioned earlier when we were talking about an AV specific FMVSS that it's hard. Well, the only way that NHTSA is going to be able to do that is if they have real world data. And so this is also, I think, a very important tool for NHTSA. We need to be thinking about this as streamlining the data that goes in to be the data that is most useful to NHTSA for that future rulemaking obligation that they have.
For sure. And what about, safety cases? Are we getting to a tipping point for federal regulators may require a more formalized safety case submission prior to broader deployments?
I think so. We get a real sense that industry has all come to sort of a consensus around this being an approach that helps them to communicate to their stakeholders, their federal regulators, to their investors, and to themselves. When I worked at Locomation, by aligning around the safety case and focusing on gathering the evidence and proving the claims that make up a safety case, it focused our work and it streamlined our efforts. And it made it so we got so much more done when we started aligning around the safety case mechanism than we had in the years before we led up to that. I mean, the progress just was exponential. So I'm a huge fan of this safety case approach because of what it does for every stakeholder, including the companies themselves. And I think that's why we've seen industry come around to this point. This is not the only area where we see safety cases being a mechanism for how the companies operate. You see it in submarines and NASA nuclear missions, or I should say nuclear facilities. It is a common sense approach that can make a lot of sense if done correctly. And judging by who Jonathan's going to have on his panels at the Tuesday event, not to keep bringing that up, but NHTSA is hosting an automated driving system workshop on the future of how we're going to regulate this technology. And some of the key people on the stage are going to be those that are loud proponents, safety advocates that support this way of going about regulating the vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Finch. It seems like we have hit a tipping point on safety case being a core element of whatever this regulatory framework is that's going to emerge. I mean, I will say just a few things. I think, so yes, safety case. Everyone agrees on that. Where we're trying to, what we're sort of focused on now, I think, where there may be some breakdowns within the stakeholder community is it only safety case or is it safety case plus, right? Like, what does the regulatory framework look like? Can a safety case be the basis of an FMVSS, or does it need to be, like Finch was talking about, part of sort of the non-FMVSS sort of regulatory approach? And then the third thing being, what must be in the safety case, right? So those are the areas where there's still, I think, some divergence of opinion and a need for consensus building. But we've definitely, I think, hit a point where safety case is a yes for everybody.
Well, and to Hilary's point, I think that what we could see playing out, and this is part of our conversations with the Self-Drive Act, is the safety case can be required, and a company must have it. Now, a safety case is a living thing. It's updated daily as, they're running more tests, doing more demonstrations. But the summary of the safety case can be ready and, provided to NHTSA so they can ask every question they want. They can go deep on any of the areas where there's terabytes of data involved in it. But being able to have that conversation with NHTSA unlocks a lot of things. They can't really do a federal motor vehicle requirement on, do you have one? Yes or no? Because that's not really a thing that fits in that bucket. But when we talk about some things that would be part of a safety case, like the operational competencies, so think of it as your driving test. How do you get your driver's license for an AV? Your vision test, however you want to simplify it, right? The 12 areas that are currently part of the voluntary safety self-assessments. Those are things, some of those are things that you can write FMVSS unders, and that you do start having that federal framework play out and preempt in the appropriate ways for the operations and performance of the vehicle. That is where I think that you'll see it playing out. And that differentiation, I think, helps people understand how the safety case rulemaking can be required. And yet you can still have a federal motor vehicle safety standard around the operational competencies, and you would only preempt around those areas. And I think that answers a lot of questions for a lot of the safety advocates and otherwise that are worried about what this can mean around the country.
For sure. Okay, and want to pivot just a bit. And Hilary, I'd love to hear from you on this first. I want to talk about U.S. competitiveness. That's become a policy argument in Washington, and I'm going to kind of combine two issues. But how does the U.S. federal posture compare with the EU and China in terms of regulatory clarity? And then things like trade policy and tariffs, how are those impacting U.S. competitiveness in the AV space?
Yeah, I mean, it's another shift I think you saw in 2025 was a clear recognition from all stakeholders about this is not just about safety. It is about safety, but it is also about competitiveness and the fact that we are in a global race to control the AV future right now. Europe, China, other parts of the world are trying to get there before us. They want to dominate the global market for AVs. And so I am sensing a shift there as well, that this is sort of a global competitiveness imperative that the US continue to lead in this space. And obviously a key ingredient of our ability to lead is a federal or is a regulatory framework that allows us to deploy at scale. So to your point, I mean, I think it's safe to say that we're starting to fall behind other parts of the world on setting, regulatory structures for AVs, and so that if we don't act this year, that we will, be at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis our regulatory framework when it comes to these technologies. On trade and tariffs, I don't know. I mean, there's obviously been a lot of news of late with Supreme Court decision that really didn't have much of an impact actually on auto tariffs. Auto tariffs fall under a different authority than what was challenged by the Supreme Court, and they are still there. So I don't know that anything's really changed much on the trade and tariff front that's noteworthy for today. But certainly the global competitiveness imperative is front and center.
In Finch, you can never have an AV conversation without some time using the word patchwork. But has the absence of a comprehensive federal legislation increased state level experimentation and fragmentation, or how do you see regulatory divergence that could complicate multi-state deployment?
Yeah, so we've talked about this before. A federalized approach in the United States makes a lot of sense, and that is the way the system is constructed. So as we've seen, what California has started to do, what Pennsylvania has done, how Texas has approached it, how Florida has approached it, Ohio, on, we are seeing an agreement about how we should allow for these technologies to be deployed on American roads. It may not seem like it at times, but we do see a coming together of this. So when you get that, and Hilary has talked a lot about all the stakeholders agreeing to it, that includes the federal and state partners, the state and local partners coming to terms with, the safety case approach, things like that, wanting to be able to have access to some of the crash data. We just need one portal to submit it to. These are things that it's not preemption, it's agreement of the federal government with the federalized system trying out these ways of doing this. And so we're at a point now where, yes, there is a patchwork, and think of it as the data repository issue. Every state can say they want the exact same data, but every state handles data in a different way. And they may have one entity that can access it. They may have two, so you have two separate agreements that have to be updated every year. And they may have different systems for how to take that in. And they may require different things from different states to be reported. If something happens in California, they may still want you to report it in Pennsylvania. And so even if they all agreed on exactly what they want and they didn't make you do these annual updates for all the privacy and data security and protections reasons, you would still have to submit that in all those different ways. Nobody wants to prevent the appropriate regulators from being able to get the information they need. They just need one place to put it, right? So that they're not doing it 100 times, for the DOTs and DMVs and state highway patrols if they've got a different system. And these are real things that other technologies in the area deal with. So having one federal repository solves so many problems, and the state and local partners that need it can get the information they need. You have the same sort of thing as you look at regulating the technology with the safety case approach, with the regulations of the safety, with the expertise to be able to understand if these vehicles meet certain operational competencies. You don't need to leave that to the folks in Mobile, Alabama to figure out. You need the federal government to handle this so that they can rely on that expertise to allow the operations in their areas. That's why it makes so much sense. And if you don't handle these issues domestically, you can't look at the international issues that Hilary was talking about. We see now that American companies have agreements in only 2 international markets. The Chinese companies have 13 international markets that they're entering into. Baidu is poised to take over as the #1 producer of automated vehicles around the world, taking the flag from American companies. That's happening this year. And if we spend all of our time fighting domestically, we can't look to expand globally. And by the time we get to it, it'll be just like EVs. China will already be there. And we'll be fighting uphill to try and gain ground. So the Chinese way of doing things will prevail instead of the American way. And so that's why it's so important that we get one federal system in, manage the legitimate concerns of all state and local regulators in the area, and be able to move forward with one federal framework.
Amen.
Okay, We're in our last minute, and this is a super speed round. We were talking before the conversation started, the three of us, about it starts to feel like Groundhog Day. Every day is Congress going to, pass a bill this year? If comprehensive AV legislation does not move in Congress, a real quick in a sentence or less, what is the most plausible incremental step that could meaningfully advance deployment? Finch.
Well, first of all, I hope and will continue to work to make sure AV legislation is included in the Surface Transportation Reauthorization. If we run out of clock in this Congress, there's always 2027, so we can come back and visit our projections next year. But in the meantime, we need NHTSA and FMCSA and DOT to use their regulatory wizardry and start locking things in so that we can enable these technologies going forward and take advantage of the time we have on the clock. Because as they hear many times, the days are long, but the hours are short. We're running out of calendar. There is a very real sense of urgency among American innovators and wizards to get these things done.
Absolutely.
And
Hillary, last word.
yeah, just two things. I would say we need somebody to clarify that manual controls are not needed for ADS dedicated vehicles. And we need somebody to clarify that the make and operative prohibition does not apply to dual use AVs. So I would say those are two incremental things that everyone agrees on. Just get them done.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for your time today, and thank you to the audience for joining us for this great conversation. You can catch the full replay of the conversation on our YouTube channel or at pavecampaign.org. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks
Thank you
all.
all.
Have a good one.